Well, that's the sports news. And as I mentioned earlier, tonight, county governors are taking the lead in popularizing the BBI constitutional amendment document that could fundamentally affect how counties operate. But will BBI achieve what the 2010 constitution could not in terms of actualizing principles of devolution? Or is the document just too good to be true? Well, joining me for that discussion tonight are Professor Governors Kibwana here with me in studio, and Professor Anyang' Nyong'o joining us virtually to give us their perspectives at a time when their counties are dealing with quite a bit. And I immediately want to start with something that happened yesterday. Professor Kibwana, I'll start with you. You moved to the Supreme Court seeking an advisory opinion on two key issues. One, which we'll actually display at some point. Let me summarize it for you. You are asking, can a bill to amend the Constitution contain more than one issue? Kindly expound, Professor Kibwana, on that.
Yes, I did go to the Supreme Court yesterday as governor of Makueni County, not Makueni County itself. And that first issue relates to, in the BBI constitutional amendment proposal, there are 78 issues, about 78 issues, and they are from 13 chapters of the Constitution, and the Constitution has 18 chapters. So the question is, can people vote on the 78 at one go? So that's a yes or no for 78 out of 264 articles of the Constitution, or should it be one by one, so that they will vote for one issue, then vote for another until they vote for 78 of them? And the reason, therefore, for asking the Supreme Court to render this advice is, ideally, when 78 matters are not necessarily related, what does a yes mean? And what does a no mean? Can it be meaningful? And that is what we are seeking the Supreme Court to guide us.
Okay. I immediately want to get a reaction from Professor Anyang' Nyong'o on this. I know you had a second question, and I'm coming to that, Professor Kibwana. But Prof. Anyang' Nyong'o, thanks again for making time for us as well. You've heard what Professor Kibwana has had to say, I'm sure. The possibility of packing too many issues in the Constitutional Amendment Bill. Professor Kibwana estimates that there are about 78 different issues for Kenyans to consider. And he goes on to say in the document we saw yesterday that it could result in a constitution that lacks internal coherence. Do you see any, do you understand or see any reasoning to the argument that Professor Kibwana is bringing before us tonight, Professor Anyang' Nyong'o?
Well, you know, I really don't think so, because if you look at the amendments to the Constitution, really, if you count them one by one, yes, they amount to 78, but they are grouped in themes in the Constitution. You know, responsibility and rights, prosperity, and so on. So when you amend one element in those particular, about 7 or 8 issues, by the way, in the Constitution, it follows consequentially that you have to amend other items in the Constitution. But they are all related, really. So I would say that there are about 7 or 8 issues in the Constitution that people will look into. I don't really think that then you have to vote into aspects of the amendment that follow from the major issue that is being dealt with. You remember, I was just thinking, we have to be very fair and honest about the BBI. The BBI said that it was concerned about 9 issues.
Yes.
Ethnic competition and antagonism, lack of a national ethos, inclusivity, devolution, divisive elections, safety and security, corruption, shared prosperity, and responsibilities and rights. Those are 9 issues in the Constitution. And if you look at the amendment and you group them under those nine issues that the BBI was concerned with, you realize that people are actually just voting on 9. That's one. The last thing I want to say, you remember when the British were going for a referendum on Brexit?
Brexit, yes.
I think people faced Brexit. They faced a similar issue. Remember the Britons who were split over issues. Yes, I would like to support Brexit, but this aspect of it I don't like. I would like not to support Brexit, but I think after the vote, even if we lose, this should happen. I think this is normal in constitutional amendments of this type and referenda of this type. And I think that I'm not surprised that Professor Kibwana went to court on this issue. I wish he had raised this issue when we were in Naivasha as governors talking about the BBI, but he didn't. If it addressed it then, we could have addressed it then, and maybe he could have benefited from our wisdom, if any, that is.
Okay. You've asked a direct question. I want to give him a chance to respond to that. Professor Kibwana, is there something possibly you could have raised earlier? And do you agree with him that we have seen in other countries referendums where there was a thought of, I do support part of the referendum, I want to be able to have a say on certain parts of it, but maybe it has been simpler to just vote on a whole document? Professor Kibwana, your thoughts on that?
I think when it comes to, of course, I really do respect Professor Nyang a lot. He was before me at the university, therefore I consider him my senior. But let me say this. Mm-hmm. All the governors, first of all, know that most of the issues that they raised were not included in BBI. And if it was not for reasons of I'm not supposed to reveal what our document was and the things that were not necessarily taken on board, I could do that, and it would be evident that although we are bending backwards to secure signatures, most of the things that we asked for as governors to strengthen devolution were not taken on board. And actually, we were waiting for Honorable Raila Odinga and the President to come to Naivasha so that we could give our views, and we were kept waiting, and they did not have time to come to us after they asked us to wait. When it comes to Brexit, that was very simple. It was, do they remain in the European Union or
Brexit? Mm-hmm.
Or not? And they decided it was just a one way. So that was just like a simple question. So you cannot make this one. You cannot compare it with the Kenyan situation where we have these 78 issues. Now, Professor says that initially we started with 9. And there is a problem there, because why would two people start a constitutional discourse? Because if at that point they told us that we were discussing the Constitution, then that was the time when all of us would have been brought on board, mm-hmm. so that it would become a Kenyan agenda. And those 9, therefore, mutated into now 78. And when Professor says that they are on themes, for example, human rights, devolution, mm-hmm. and all that. Even the suggestions as of now is we don't vote on themes. Because if the suggestions already was we vote on themes, that would still be a different matter. But the question is, you have 78 issues that you have to vote for. The Kenyan who has not done a lot of law or a lot of political science or a lot of those things, is it fair to ask them to vote for 78 things at the same time? And even now, as signatures are being collected, most of them are saying, what are we having these signatures for? We don't really know what we are signing for. And like today, I was in a funeral where people are being told, sign, this is something to say you were here in a funeral because of COVID. And then when we looked at it, we discovered that it is BBI forms. So I think there is a problem.
Your team actually confirmed that, and,
yes.
and you saw that yourself, Governor.
Yes, and I actually, have even a video, of that.
Okay. Which is part, okay, so, and that's part of the second question. I don't know if we're able to project the second question that you asked, and let me ask you this, Governor Kibwana, briefly, whether national governments or county governments or state officers can use popular initiative route and public resources to amend the Constitution. Let me get a brief expansion of that as part of your questions to the Supreme Court before I allow Governor Nyang' to respond.
Yes, the Constitution has two ways of being amended. One way is when citizens want to amend it, and they are supposed to collect signatures, then it goes for voting in the county assemblies, then it goes to Parliament. Even if Parliament does not vote for it, it goes into a referendum if there are referendum issues involved. Mm-hmm. Then when government wants to amend the Constitution, there is a system of Parliament starting it, and it goes to the referendum if there are referendum issues. But then there is a high threshold for Parliament. At least 2/3 of all members of parliamentary senate and the National Assembly. So the question is, can actually government now decide to go the citizens' route instead of going the parliamentary route? Because it's actually harder when you're faced with a referendum question to process it through the parliamentary system.
Okay, let me bring in Governor Anyang' Nyong'o. First, Governor, there's a question that Governor Kibwana has posed that I want you to weigh in on, whether BBI really reflects the wishes of governors in terms of devolution, because there was a wish list that we had seen of what governors wanted included in the BBI, and they waited in Naivasha to meet the president and ODM leader Raila Odinga. Some of the proposals were around having, for example, the role of the control of budget should not only be limited to ensuring that funds disbursed are in conformity to the budget, but also perform other functions, speeding up of the flow of funds to the counties. They want the Office of the Controller of Budget decentralized to 47 counties, amongst many other proposals that the governors had, that we've had some governors saying were not included in the final document. Professor Anyang' Nyong'o, your response to that, speaking tonight as one who has embraced the BBI?
Let me say something. You know, I was very firm myself well before the referendum, really, process started, just as the BBI was going on. In fact, even when the BBI started, I wrote several articles in the Star newspapers defending or promoting or proposing a pure parliamentary system. And they even published a book to that effect, which the Prime Minister himself launched at the University of Nairobi. But when I read the BBI, I found that the pure parliamentary system was not there. But then I said, look, in history, in political processes, you don't get everything that you want. And I think that what we have gotten in Kenya today is a kind of an intermediate regime, a regime between what we might have in future as a pure parliamentary system, and something is now there as a hybrid. And this is reflective of a cultural and ethnic diversity. You remember, one of the aims of the BBI was to deal with ethnic and cultural diversity and improve inclusiveness. So when I looked at the BBI as a whole and look at the goals or the issues that was raised at the beginning of the BBI, which have been enumerated now, I found out that it has dealt largely with these. And if we lose some of the things we're proposing, but we gain on the major issues that the BBI was looking at, we can, in future, go back to these issues. History is not written in one paragraph. History is usually written in a whole book. So I think this is something that we should be positive about, rather than expect that it was a maximal gain that we needed and not something that we can live with now while we are perfecting inclusivity, cohesion, and prosperity, really.
Because I was going to ask you this, Prof. Some would then say, why don't we, take more time to fully explore, for example, the proposal that you've raised about a pure parliamentary system? Because what stops someone after the next election, to begin then saying the solution for Kenya is a pure parliamentary system? That could happen very soon, and Kenya could find itself once again in another referendum cycle in the near future. Some would say, why don't we be more patient in this process?
No, the point is that we have made progress. I mean, let us accept that. Let's not be too arrogant and say that we have not made progress in this constitution. In addressing some of the important issues that have not been addressed by the 2010 constitution in terms of practical application of constitutional governance. You can have a constitution, and when it comes to constitutional governance, because of historical, social, and political reasons, you may not do it. Then you must look at your constitution and say, what must we do to make steps forward? That's why I'm talking about an intermediate regime. Maybe I can get time later at another forum to elaborate on that. But I think that the regime that will be produced by this constitution will be in a position to open more doors to implementing the 2010 constitution in areas which it has been difficult to implement it. I think that having ministers as member of parliament is an improvement because it's going to cut down on cost rather than increase it. Because as ministers and members of parliament, I remember when I was a minister, I earned my salary in parliament. The only thing I got as a minister was some allowance. At the moment, actually, government is even more expensive because you have these private individuals from the private sector who are not members of parliament, who are ministers. They waste a lot of time attending parliamentary committees to answer questions. It will be much quicker and much more cost-effective if they answer these questions on the floors of parliament. The Prime Minister himself shall also be a member of parliament. And like we had in the coalition government, it's a much more effective way of dealing with democratic governance than we have at the moment.
Okay, you raise an interesting point. Although some would then argue that some of the new offices that will be created will come with their own expenses that could reverse the gains made with some of the points that you have raised.
No, not really.
I mean, the office of a prime minister, for example.
Not really. I would like...
Go ahead.
Go
ahead.
I don't think so. I don't think so because I would like somebody to do the arithmetic and put the figures on the table. If you put the figures on the table, you will find that the Prime Minister is just a Prime Minister. As a member of Parliament, he doesn't have any extra salary as a Prime Minister. He will give them allowances, just like the leader of the opposition, the majority leader or the minority leader now has allowances. They have cars, they have all these things under the present constitution. So what will happen really is that the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Ministers will have just allowances or some benefits like having cars, which all leaders in Parliament have anyway now. So I don't really think that if you do arithmetic, you can prove that government is going to be more expensive under the present BBI proposals than before.
Okay, and we can crunch the math a bit later. Let me ask Professor Kibwana this. If the Supreme Court, Prof, agrees with you on the questions you've asked, then what happens next? Because ideally the advisory is now binding and actually becomes the law of the land.
I think before I answer that question, let me react a bit to what a professor said regarding the executive, the proposed new executive. Professor says that history is not written in paragraphs. But I think what we have done now, we add maybe 2 paragraphs, and we have reduced our history into half a paragraph. Why do I say this? I say this because the parliamentary system that Professor talked about, that is something that was very dear to us, even at Bombers. And I remember, and I really say as being an advocate of that, I remember the first Yash guy draft, the Bombers draft, the harmonized draft of Zamba Kitonga. All those had robust prime ministers, where even in some instances the prime minister was leader of government and the president head of state. The prime minister was supposed to appoint cabinet ministers, and the president with consultation with the president, and even he or she would chair cabinet. And this was because during the one-party system, we saw that the president had a lot of power, and we were trying even for the executive to balance that kind of power. So even during the so-called Nusumukate government of President Kibaki and Raila Odinga, the prime minister had consultative powers, and actually there were certain things that the president couldn't do without concurrence with the prime minister, and the professor was very much part of that setup. So the system that now BBI proposes is a system where the prime minister is just a glorified, actually, minister, and he or she may be in charge of subcommittees of cabinet. There isn't really control of to any big way of the president and so on. The deputy prime ministers can be fired, by the president when they are minister, they can be fired. So there isn't really much movement because this is the weakest prime minister, deputy prime minister. In all the constitutions that the drafts that we have had, including the independence constitution. So I think we haven't made much movement there whatsoever. And that is why initially I was thinking, when there was the national conversation about what we would do, I was myself saying, let us support this. Let us support the national conversation. Let us support...
We did actually see you at a rally or two.
Precisely. I did that. And actually, all those rallies we went to. Now, later, the things that we were proposed, if you put them side by side with the BBI, you will discover that most of the things that they talked about, land, they talked about the Corruption Commission being within the Constitution, most of those things that they talked about are not in BBI whatsoever. So there is a major problem. And
why do you think this happened? Sorry for interrupting you on this, but why do you think that happened?
You know,
I've had time to reflect.
Yes, I have had time to reflect. We didn't know that this push for the Constitution there was almost a predetermined result. The predetermined results being there would be some executive which looked like it included everybody, and yet it included certain personalities. It included, you know, let us say the main ethnic groups in the country would always have a seat at the table because they are like about 70%. But even if we were to consider that there is democratic sense in that, you still must provide for the rest of Kenyans so that they don't say, you know, we are not part of our country. So I think for me, BBI actually is about influencing, one could even say rigging the next election. And even now, you have, as I conclude, you have a few leaders who are from certain ethnic groups. They are pushing this BBI, and we are not seeing the cohesion and lack of negative ethnicity that we were promised.
You've made
it is still the same guys, same, you know, faces pushing on an ethnic basis.
You've made a very strong claim tonight, which I'll have to give the good Professor Nyang' a chance to respond to after the break. But tell me this briefly, Prof. What then happens if the Supreme Court agrees with you? Have you foreseen that far ahead? What's your legal team, for example, telling you?
If the Supreme Court agrees, and that's our prayer, then it means that we have to come back to the drawing board.
Which means what? A new BBI document?
Which means it's a new beginning, unless the leadership decides that they will not follow the opinion of the Supreme Court.
My goodness. Okay. I really wish I could have get that right of reply from Professor Nyang', but let's take that quick break. Do we take that break? Let's take that break so that I give him ample time to respond to some of the things Professor Kibwana has had to say tonight. Thanks for keeping it Newsnight. We take a short break. We'll be right back. We carry on digging deep into the BBI with the two professor governors. Very glad to have them on the show. Remember, the SMS line is 22422. We'll be right back with more on this discussion.